The amygdala comes up in every conversation I have about the brain. Well, nearly every conversation. And it's not because I love saying the word. I definitely do not. It tongue-ties me. This is your fair warning that you may hear something unusual in this video clip. The amygdala is central to our understanding of behavior, of how it comes about and why it comes about the way that it does, and how it's connected with other things in the brain. And I'd like to talk with you about some of the basic functions of the amygdala and where it is in the brain, how it interacts with other parts of the brain, and what kind of stuff I think would be most valuable for you to know as you go forward being a scientist in your own family and observing behavior to try to figure out what insight you can get from behavior. Behavior is a symptom, a sign of other things that are happening. Behavior comes from somewhere. And so when we understand and can look at behavior from an objective point of view, we have a much better chance of being able to help the person that needs help, whether that's a child or a partner or ourselves, as is frequently the case. So let's talk a little bit about where the amygdala is. It lives in the temporal lobe of the brain. That's one of 4 lobes, and if we're looking at the handy-dandy brain model, that's right here in the thumb is where the amygdala is. If I were to draw a line straight back from my eye to the back of my head and then from ear to ear, the amygdala would be roughly at the intersection of those 2 lines. And it's bilateral, meaning that I would have one line going back for each eye. It's on both sides of the brain. And in popular science, you'll hear the amygdala described as being an almond-shaped structure, which is true. It is almond-shaped. It's also bigger than that almond-shaped structure. And when we first identified the amygdala and knew what it did, we were looking at that little almond-shaped piece. But now we know that it's bigger and that it has more functions. So the amygdala does a lot of really important things. And the first thing that the amygdala does is it is the processing center for all of our senses. Everything that we see, hear, smell, touch, taste, all of that runs through the amygdala. And one of the reasons for that is because the amygdala, in its second function, is the alarm system for the brain, which we talk about quite a bit when we're talking about parent-child relationships. It looks at all of the input that's coming in from the environment so that it can make decisions about what is safe and what is not, where there are threats. And so those 2 functions are really closely tied together. They need to be in the same spot so things can happen very quickly and accurately. One of the other things that the amygdala does, the third function, is that it's the emotional center of the brain. It's part of the limbic system, which is the emotional system. And in the amygdala, we see different warehouses, I guess is the best way to describe them, or centers of core emotions. And where science is now is we think that the entire spectrum of human emotion is possible, comes from these core emotions in different types of combinations. So in the amygdala, we see centers for things like fear and rage. We see separation, distress, and anxiety, which, as you might expect, is a really powerful emotional trigger for children. We see play. We see bonding. All of those things are good and bad, are in the amygdala and are just waiting to be expressed at the right time. The amygdala is also the place where where our motivation comes from within the brain. It's the motivational center as well. And this makes a lot of sense because motivation is very closely tied to emotion, right? You understand, of course, through experience that when you have positive feelings and associations about something, that you are more motivated to do it. And if something has been painful or terrifying or any other type of negative experience, then you are not as motivated to do it. That makes loads of sense. Um, and also tied to that is the fifth big function of the amygdala, and that is learned responses. So if you think back to what you learned in science class about Pavlov and his experiments with his dogs and ringing the bell and issuing food and things like that, this has been done in so many different ways with things like electric shock and other adverse stimuli, as we would call them, bad stuff that's happening in the environment. And the amygdala is responsible for developing those associations for us so that we know the next time something like that comes into the environment, that the amygdala, of course, would recognize, being that it's processing all of the sensory input, that it can very quickly get the message out to the rest of the brain that, oh, this is a bad thing, we need to be ready for it. Here's what we're going to do. So those are the 5 basic functions of the amygdala. It does all of the sensory, it processes the sensory input. It's the emotional center. It houses motivation. It houses the alarm center for the brain so that we know what is threatening and what isn't. And it also does learned responses. Those things are so closely tied together, so it makes sense that they are living in one place. The amygdala also has other very close relationships with structures in the brain. One of them being the hippocampus, which is just next door, really. And the hippocampus is where we think about memory processing. One of the big functions of the hippocampus is processing short-term memories for long-term storage. So as we're experiencing a whole bunch of stuff and the amygdala is taking in all of the sensory input, it's sending some messages to the hippocampus about these are the things that we need to remember. These are the things that are associated together so that we can learn about those responses where something may be introduced into the environment and then we need to adjust accordingly, like Pavlov's experiment. So that stuff gets shipped off to the hippocampus so that we can reference it later. It's also really closely tied to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is the part of the brain, one of the parts of the brain, that is responsible for releasing hormones. So the amygdala gets excited and it says, hey, we have this emergency, we need to get ready to run, or we need to get ready to fight. So it will send a message to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus will say, all right, let's get this rolling, and release stress hormones so that we are equipped to deal with the response. And this primary stress hormones are adrenaline and cortisol and norepinephrine. There are lots of others, but those are the ones that we talk about. And these hormones go into the bloodstream and they circulate, and they're designed to be there for a little while because we don't know how long the emergency will last. As the amygdala continues to be stimulated, continues to perceive a threat, it will continue to signal the hypothalamus to release these chemicals, these hormones. And this becomes a really vicious cycle in people that are enduring long-term chronic stress that's at a very high level, because the unfortunate thing about the amygdala is that what it perceives as a threat is not necessarily a threat that we need to get that excited about. Evolution has not caught up with our brains in that regard. So the amygdala was designed to alert us about predators that may be lurking in the bushes. And it's designed to be hyperactive because it is very costly to not notice something in the environment and become horribly wounded or die. It is much more productive to overreact to things. And so we have this overreaction bias with the amygdala because that's what evolution has designed for us. That's a lot of information, I know. So when we're releasing these chemicals, these hormones into the bloodstream, if we're continually getting the message that it's still a threatening situation, we have all of that stuff in our system all the time, or very small breaks between when it starts up again. And that's overwhelming, and that definitely influences our behavior as well. So the big relationship here, though, is with the prefrontal cortex. That is on the outside of the brain in the cerebral cortex. And if we're looking at Dr. Siegel's handy-dandy brain model, it's where approximately our fingernails would be, in the upstairs brain portion. The prefrontal cortex is the part that would step in and say, yeah, amygdala, I see you have all of this stuff going on, and I can see that there's a lot of stuff here, but let me check in with hippocampus and see, oh, yeah, we did that a couple months ago, and it wasn't a big deal. Or we overreacted last time, and we know we can dial it back this time. There's another way to approach this without it being an emergency. That's what the prefrontal cortex says. It looks for other ways to use the body's resources productively to respond to the situation. The amygdala wants to react to the situation and do it immediately, and it's very instinctual, whereas the prefrontal cortex says, let's sit back and look at this and really think about it. We have some time. We'll come up with a strategy. We'll have a great plan. We'll use what we have efficiently, and things will be good. Here is the kicker. The amygdala begins developing in utero in the 3rd trimester. For a baby who's born full term, the amygdala is fully formed, finished, complete. There's no more development that happens with it. It's ready to roll as an adult functioning amygdala. That's pretty awesome. And that's very necessary because that infant does need to have strong emotional responses to things, does need to have strong fear responses, strong responses for separation distress, strong bonding responses. All of that stuff needs to be there, ready to go. The prefrontal cortex, on the other hand, that starts developing a few months after birth, and it doesn't finish until early to mid-20s. That's a long time. So in our behavior, we rely on the prefrontal cortex to inform us and to intervene with the amygdala and say, calm down, this isn't a big deal. There's another way to do this. In children, that connection is not there. Parts of it may be there. The full structure is not operational. So there are going to be days when it seems like it's fully in service, and it is. And then the next day, it may not be. None of it may be in service. Only parts of it may be in service. We can't rely on that type of function until that prefrontal cortex is fully developed, which is most cases after they move out of the house. So our role as parents is to step in and realize that we need to take on some of the responsibility of being the prefrontal cortex and saying, okay, let's look at this situation and figure out what to do. This is not an emergency. These are our options. And there are lots of ways to do that in age-appropriate ways. So it's once you have a child who is able to not necessarily talk, but just comprehend language and respond to it, you can start talking through some of this stuff so that they learn about how to do this check and balance process within themselves. When the amygdala runs the show, we see things like people who are slamming doors, they're shouting, they're yelling, they're hitting, they're kicking, screaming. All of those kinds of very visceral, intense emotional displays, that's amygdala running the show. And that's the kind of stuff that we want to intervene because that doesn't need to happen. And the more we exhibit that kind of behavior, the more the amygdala senses that we're under additional threat. So it will continue signaling to the hypothalamus, we need more stress hormones because we may need to do more stuff. And it just becomes a very vicious cycle.